to discuss the administration's foreign relations budget request. All of us have great respect for you, Madam Secretary, as well as for the dedicated men and women who promote the interests and values of our nation throughout the world. Our nation faces unsustainable deficits, so we must justify every dollar that we spend, especially because 35 cents of every dollar is borrowed. I appreciate your restraint with the top-line number in your budget proposal, coming in at $5.1 billion below last year's request. But I disagree with the priorities and programs funded with those limited resources. In Iraq and Afghanistan, both these governments must be pushed to take the necessary steps to be our long-term, reliable partners. We are not seeing such a commitment from Karzai or Maliki. Too much American blood and treasure have been invested in both countries for us to have governments in place that threaten American interests. Iran's belligerent and unhelpful role in Afghanistan and Iraq is worrisome, particularly with reports indicating their co-option of those governments at senior levels. So, Madam Secretary, what additional pressure can we bring to bear to offset the Iranian influence in Afghanistan and Iraq? In Pakistan, the level of cooperation, as we know, that we get from the government continues to fall short. Serious questions persist about whether elements of the Pakistani government support prominent insurgent groups fighting against our troops in Afghanistan. In other Middle Eastern countries, I've had concerns from day one about the administration's approach to the Arab Spring and to the forces at work there, including radical Islamist groups. The administration appears focused on spending a lot of money in search of a policy. Your budget request doubles down on that approach by requesting a $770 million Middle East and North Africa incentive fund, a fund with almost no restriction on how it can be used. Even though press reports indicate that Egypt may have decided to lift the travel ban on our NGO workers, we should not reward Egypt with aid when it is demonstrating hostility to Western democratic entities and is engaging in an ongoing dance between authoritarians and the Muslim Brotherhood. In contrast, the administration did the right thing by enforcing U.S. law and cutting off funding to UNESCO after it undermined peace by admitting the non-existent state of Palestine. Your request to now change the law and send $80 million to UNESCO would be a grave mistake. Any weakening of U.S. law would undermine our credibility and give a green light for other UN agencies to grant recognition of a Palestinian state. U.S. funding for UNESCO must only be restored if UNESCO votes to unadmit Palestine. The budget for the Western Hemisphere, which is not mentioned in the prepared testimony, is another example of misplaced priorities. The administration has requested an increase in funding for the general budget of the Organization of American States, yet you cut U.S. contributions to the OAS Fund for Strengthening Democracy by almost $2 million. The administration is proposing increased financial assistance to Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Ecuador, three governments that continue to undermine U.S. security interests in the hemisphere, disregard human rights, and ignore the rule of law. There can be no justification for such an increase in funds to these countries. In Nicaragua, state has spent millions to promote free, fair, and transparent elections. That money was not used wisely, as the elections in Nicaragua were fraudulent and ran afoul of the Nicaraguan Constitution. We must not repeat last year's performance in Ecuador or Bolivia, where State Departments spent more money on environmental programs than counter-narcotics operations or good governance. This budget fails to hold abusers of democracy in the region accountable and cuts support for democracy. Instead of standing in solidarity with the Cuban and Venezuelan people in their time of need, this budget turns its back on them. Repression continues unabated in Cuba. The Castro regime orders its state security forces to beat members of the Ladies in White, Las Damas de Blanco, as they leave church services on Sundays. Prisoners of conscience die, while many worldwide turn a blind eye to their plight. In Venezuela, the Chavez regime has demolished the authority of the National Assembly and intimidated the opposition by leveraging control over the judicial system. Turning to the disastrous situation in Syria, this administration does not appear to have a coherent strategy. The Russians and the Iranians clearly have a strategy, and it could be summarized as actively support the repression by the Syrian army. The Iranian regime defies responsible nations and pursues nuclear weapons capabilities. A nuclear-armed Iran is unacceptable, and we must oppose any policy that relies on mere containment as a response to this mortal threat. President Obama has said that the United States has an ironclad commitment to the security of Israel. So will the U.S. militarily back Israel if it decides to protect itself from an Iranian nuclear threat? Finally, Madam Secretary, I have grave concerns about today's North Korea announcement, which sounds a lot like the failed agreements of the past. While it is good that it mentions the uranium enrichment program, whose existence the North Koreans had so long denied, we must recall that regime's constant duplicity. We have bought this bridge several times before. One troubling new aspect is the discussion of nuclear issues and food aid in the same announcement, which blurs the separation of humanitarian aid from the nuclear negotiations, which has been maintained since 1995. The North Koreans will view this food as payment due for their return to the bargaining table, regardless of the transparency and monitoring we hope to secure in the future. Again, Madam Secretary, thank you so much for making yourself available today. I look forward, and the members do as well, to receiving your testimony.